Antonio Guterres, and before him, Shinzo Abe. Well, for more on all that, I'm joined now in the studio by Dr. Ken Ife, who is a macroeconomic policy analyst as well as a lead consultant to ECOWAS, the World Bank, and the African Development Bank, and Chineme Okafor, who's a business and energy correspondent with This Day newspaper. Thank you very much indeed for coming in. I'll start with you, Dr. Ken. Is it fair to say that Japan is, in quantitative terms, a pretty negligible player in Africa compared to China or the European Union?
Well, without a doubt. But why is that is the case for Japan, and I know that the momentum is there, but you can't actually equate Japan's approach to that of China or even European Union. There's a subtle difference between the two, China and Japan. One is, you know, that the developed countries have a commitment, or ODA, Overseas Development Assistance, the commitment of 0.7% of their GDP to developing countries. So what is playing out with Japan is more about how they deliver those within the ambit of the ownership of African leaders. And then also the partnership that they are using, which is UN system, which, you know, their main agenda is delivery of sustainable development goals.
Yes.
World Bank, which, you know, its main agenda is how to deliver the loans for the infrastructure and all these others, using some of the money from Japan. You know, you have different funding structures going into Japan and coming through. And some of them come out as blended finance. Then, of course, you have Japan's own agency like JICA, that is there to develop, deliver some of those grant-based schemes. And in fact, they are doing a lot of work. If you look at the mix of the work they are doing, they are working on energy, they are working on some infrastructure, even dam, they have a mix and some social inclusion agenda. So the JICA is there, and they're doing a mix. And and an African Union that has its own agenda, Agenda 2063, the 50-year infrastructure master plan for Africa. So you've got all those. It's strategic partnership with everybody owning what they want to bring to the table. And then, so it's not destructive for China. China is about their Belt and Road Initiative, about their land. China is not so much on grant thing. They want to, actually, China, rather than get involved in development assistance, their commitment to Africa is we'll pay a fair price. And that fair price is actually what brought Africa into a high growth platform since 2005. You know, that's why Africa, you know, started getting the right price.
So it's more of a quid pro quo. You give us, we'll give you.
Absolutely.
Sort of thing.
And then, and there's a lot of lending, G2G lending, some of which are hurting, you know,
yes,
as
of
you
course,
may know, Zambia and all sort of places. So there's a difference. And China is actually more aggressive, you know, in business terms. Whereas Japan is a bit more laid back.
But would you say that China is more attractive in business terms to Africa?
The thing is, China is anybody and everybody goes to China because when you go there, you make money.
Right.
And China has so much to offer to Africa.
Right. That's a good point. Let me bring Chineme Okafor there from This Day newspaper, because of course Japan doesn't have the massive internal market, as Dr. Ken was saying there, that could soak up African commodities in a way that China does. But from a journalistic point of view, tell us your assessment of what is going on in Japan with this trade conference, this investment development conference, let's call it that.
Well, I like to talk from the perspective of Nigeria. I expected that Nigeria would go to Japan with the message to Japan that we have to develop our LNG industry. The Nigerian LNG is looking for investors to expand its capacity. And Japan is one of the highest consumers of Nigeria's liquefied natural gas. And so I expected the president and our trade teams to go to Japan to say to Japan, we want to develop our LNG industry. We have OK LNG that is still in the pipeline. We have other LNG projects, Brass LNG, and you are a huge consumer of our LNG. So could you pitch in your money into this? That would
And that could have helped develop a bigger infrastructure.
So it would have been a win-win for both countries.
Right.
So you give me and I give you
Right.
back.
I mean, something that would have probably dovetailed into an area that you're very conversant with, which is energy.
Exactly.
Because one of the big problems that's holding electricity back is gas,
Yeah,
and the lack of infrastructure for gas.
And the good thing about it is that Japan is also playing heavily in Nigeria's electricity industry. It has some good investment or some.
So it could have been a natural transition.
Yes,
really.
in the transmission network of
Right.
Nigeria, and so it could have been a natural transition.
But let me ask you this before I return to Dr. Ken. I mean, because Japan has pledged to help Africa, and by extension Nigeria, double its current rice production levels by the year 2030. It's saying that it'll help it raise it to 50 million tons a year using Japanese technology. I mean, isn't that something that is a big part of this government's sort of agenda, of its program, that it wants to diversify into agriculture, and everybody is saying, yes, let's get into agriculture because that'll help employ a lot of young people, keep them from moving from the villages into the cities, and give them productive work using Japanese technology.
It is, and I think that Japan already started that some couple of months ago. I think in April, the embassy here in Nigeria, through JICAD, signed some contracts with rice farmers in Nigeria's Nasarawa state and some states like Kano and all that. And I think it's a couple of millions of dollars that they are giving to rice farmers to upgrade their production. And so it's a good one for the government. It's also good for Africa that this is coming.
Right. And Dr. Ken, beyond sort of what we've just been talking about with agriculture, and you may want to comment on that as well if you want, but I mean, how would you say that Japan is positioning itself in Africa? Because what we're more used to is seeing Japan as a supplier of high-tech equipment. I mean, particularly in, for instance, the transportation sector. You've got Japanese motorbikes, Japanese cars, they've all got a very good reputation in Africa.
Yeah, that's quite correct. But it's facing stiffer competition right now from the likes of China and South Korea.
But China isn't supplying cars in Nigeria,
where is Dinoson's partnership coming
right.
from? It's from China. And there are many of the 17 licensed car assembly plants that are in partnership with China, but except that they still haven't materialized yet. But coming to agriculture, yes, Japan is. We need their help on rice. Rice is one of the 10 value chains. We have tomato, we have cotton, poultry, about oil, palm, cocoa. There are 10 value chains. And actually, in all of this value chain, Japan represents a market for some of those, as well as a potential investor.
Right.
And we would encourage Japan to come into our export-free zones where they can own it 100%, and then from there use it as a staging post to sell to America, because they are the next in target from Donald Trump. He's heading there. He's looking at Germany. He's looking at Japan.
Yes.
After all the trouble he's having with China, so they are on the list. So the same way I encourage China to invest, bring in their manufacturers into our free trade zone, and then go back through AGOA to sell the same product and escape the 25% duty. Japan should be thinking along that direction. But yes, South Africa supplies, I think, well over 40% of the vegetables that Japan consumes. So Japan does have an internal market, but nowhere near China. But China is not even buying, but they're committed to do so within the context of our 10 value chain. For example, cassava. They're opening up the market for cassava, and there are other things that we could sell to them. And even our biofuel, which is also cassava for bioethanol, has market both in Japan and China. So yes, but I don't think that is late in the day, because there are bilateral meetings and side meetings while the conference is going on.
Right, so that issue
so
of LNG and all that
all
could still,
come.
it's not
They're all
over
on the
yet.
table, because the president has gone with the relevant ministers,
Right.
and they're all having side meetings. And when the program allocation is done, we will obviously be heading down to World Bank and ADB, whoever is having their money, to negotiate some of the loans.
But is it, I mean, we've got less than a minute to go. Should Africa be negotiating as a body now, given the free trade area that's coming up? Or is it still essentially broken up into sort of different, individual countries? Very, very, very briefly, because we've got
I think
about
it's a
15
mixture
seconds.
of both. It's a mixture of both, because the African Union negotiating, they have a 2064 huge infrastructure agenda, long term. So they are in their position to
So in
negotiate.
The long term, it's the big one.
That's
in
right,
the short
the big
term,
one.
it's individual.
Because most of the countries...
Just hold that thought there. You're watching the Arise interview. Plenty more still ahead as we continue our focus on the Japan-African Development Conference and the economic growth indicators coming out of Africa. Stay with us. With me in the studio, Dr. Ken Ife, who's a macroeconomic policy analyst as well as a lead consultant to ECOWAS, the World Bank and the African Development Bank, and Chineme Okafor, who's a business and energy correspondent with This Day newspaper. Thank you for staying with us. So, in many ways, Chineme, Japan is a much narrower market for Africa, but it's still worth it.
Yeah, it is worth it. I think, being narrow, but at the same time, what matters is what Japan is offering Africa. I mean, China could offer Africa so much, but the value may not really be what Africa needs. We've had cases of countries that are not very, very prosperous with the Chinese money, and then if Japan is offering you a valuable stuff, then you can't really describe it as being narrow in that sense. I still want to talk about Nigeria and Japan. Like 3 months ago, I gathered from the embassy of Japan in Nigeria that the cooperative trade between Nigeria and Japan, Nigeria has some level of advantage because of the LNG and sesame seed that Nigeria exports to Japan. So if Nigeria could leverage that, it means that we could have continue to have that healthy trade advantage with Japan. In TICAD, in as much as the African Union would or may want to negotiate as a bloc, I still think that countries should also negotiate individually. We all have peculiar needs, no matter how much of infrastructure challenge we have.
Well, the African trade area hasn't really taken off yet. So, I mean, obviously they have to negotiate on their own. But just in terms of the economic indicators, the growth indicators that everybody's talking about. I mean, we at the introduction there, we talked about Africa averaging 4 to 5% a year in growth compared to Europe, for example, which is less than 1%. But I mean, that does not necessarily apply to Nigeria, does it? Because I mean, that's an average across the continent, but Nigeria is not growing anywhere near that percentage.
But it's an average, and Nigeria is part of Africa, and I believe that average would include Nigeria. Yes, we've just come out of recession, and we're growing gradually, and it's an opportunity for us to also grow. Oil pushes growth, and so if we can, gain some deals in Japan, we could sustain.
Right, but Dr. Ken Ife, I mean, just taking off from that, Nigeria needs whatever it can get, isn't it? I mean, that's why if anybody rings the slightest bell, I mean, Buhari's on a plane heading to that place because he's made so many promises, and he just does. I mean, he doesn't have the capacity within Nigeria. I mean, there is the potential to develop it, but the capacity is not there to do it. So he needs all the help he can get.
We need the partnerships, we need the access to infrastructure finance. I'm glad they are bringing in risk mitigation from Japan, very helpful. And the president, as you could see, is leading from the front and very aggressive, in this current dispensation. So I expect him to be jumping up and down and grabbing every opportunity that there is to diversify our economy, so to say. And the fact that Japan has actually pointed at rice, but sesame seed, for example, I've seen a report, a projection, that in sesame seed alone, we are capable of earning $4.3 billion. I mean, you don't have to have 10 value chains going to Japan, just 1 or 2. You can develop it,
But I mean, as you pointed out before, it's still down to commodities, which is which is a very unpredictable market that you do not control the price. I mean, you see what I mean? It's like you talked about the value chain, and you know the value chain just doesn't exist.
Well, I gave you an example how China is interested in the cassava, processed cassava starch, which I think is about $400. Cassava chips, dried cassava, $200 a ton. So they are processed. So, you know, that journey of 100 miles begin with a step, and that is a positive one. And they're under pressure right now with what is going on between China and America. They're under immense pressure, where the tariff has gone up from 10 to 25% and even heading to 30% as you're widening the net.
Well, actually, on that note, we've just heard that they appear to have backed down, because usually when America comes up with new tariffs, China immediately retaliates. But this time, today, China has said it's not going to retaliate with the latest tariffs, and it's elicited a positive response from Donald Trump, because he's just announced that there are going to be new talks starting from today, and that it's going to be on a higher level. But that's not really the focus of this discussion.
It's a moving target.
Yeah.
What he hasn't told you is that he has reduced and removed the tariff. He's not going to remove the tariff because he's making money.
Yeah, he is. He did say that.
And both economies are suffering because they're all losing jobs.
Yeah. But just getting back to to Africa and Japan. I mean, he was talking about the aggressive approach that Buhari is putting forth. You have a wry smile on your face there, which suggests that you don't agree that he's putting on an aggressive front. But nevertheless, he has, I mean, you have to give it to him that he goes to these conferences, whether or not there is enough follow-up and you know, enough sort of a good plan when he goes there to try and attract the business is the question. Because, I mean, there are at least 25 heads of state there. So, you know, the Japanese pie, everybody is going for it. So you've got to have a pretty darn good plan if you want to get a piece of the pie.
Absolutely. I mean, it's so competitive, and you just can't go there without concrete plans. I do not think the president has gone to Japan with a lot of push. I do not think the president is pushing as hard as he should to get Nigeria out of where we are now. Without prejudice to whatever plans or intentions is had, I always look at Cyril Ramaphosa of South Africa to say, this is the kind of push. Who is also there. Yeah, who is also there. This is the kind of push we should be going for. You talk about the Kenyan president, this is the kind of push we should be going. If you're going to Japan and you're going with two items, sesame seeds and LNG, and you're saying to the Japanese, this is what I've come to Japan with. Can you chip in? And you're pushy and you're punching and fighting hard to get.
Yeah, but as Ken said, I mean, there's no evidence that he hasn't gone with that.
Well,
because the meeting's not over. We haven't seen what he's bringing back from there.
Well, I agree, but at the same time, I also want to believe that if you're setting out to do something, you should show to your people, Nigerians, this is what I'm going to Japan for. We haven't seen that. We believe his...
Well, you asked for a lot, don't you? I mean, he didn't show you his cabinet list or his portfolios for the cabinet members, and you sit here and you want him to show you what he's going to show the Japanese.
That's standard practice. I mean, we should realize as Nigerians that the world does not operate on Nigerian standards. The world operates on global standards.
No, absolutely.
And so if you don't key into those global standards, then you're not
right.
The world isn't going to wait for you to...
No, absolutely, you're right. And Dr. Ken, we've got like a couple of minutes left before we have to take another break. But anecdotally, we've heard that Japan did not want to disclose the exact number of African leaders attending that conference in case China puts pressure on them not to turn up. So, I mean, that's quite extraordinary, isn't it? And we have this on fact. And that gives a bit of indication about the fight for Africa's economies. I mean, that should be a bit heartwarming, shouldn't it?
Well, China and Japan are on different trajectories, and we have no apologies to offer for that. As I told you, that China has their own strategic agenda. Of course, Belt and Road Initiative is one of them, and they have mainly and largely lending portfolios. So you got that. But Japan is on a different trajectory. Now, yes, they want to get closer, but it has always been drawn and dominated. And they have strategic partners that are working with. It's not just them. They have UNC, United Nations Development Agency. You have World Bank. You have themselves. Then you have African Union. So they're approaching it in a. It's different, and is based on delivering their commitment of 0.7% of their GDP, and as part of it, so you have a mix of overseas development assistance, you have grant technical assistance, then you have loan, and then you have embedded, in concessionary loans, embedded finance. So you have all these mix, but behind that, we need to, as you say, up our game in terms of what we want to get out of it. And don't forget that the president wears two hats. He wears the hat of ECOWAS chairing, and of course Nigeria. So he's there, and it gives a lot of comfort.
All right. With me in the studio, Dr. Ken Ife, who's a macroeconomic policy analyst, as well as a lead consultant to ECOWAS, the World Bank, and the African Development Bank. He certainly isn't poor. Chineme Okafor, who's a business and energy correspondent with This Day newspaper. Thank you very much indeed for staying with us. I didn't mean to take a dig at you there, but I mean, with all those titles, I don't expect that you're scratching the ground for your next meal. But this is something of a paradox, isn't it? Because here you have 7 of the 10 fastest growing economies in the world today, all of them in sub-Saharan Africa. Growth is picking up. There are encouraging developments across the continent. More and more children said to be, an emphasis on said to be, getting into school. Child survival rates are improving. There's improvement in nutrition. How can child poverty be increasing?
Well, the thing is, the fact that you have growth in some of our economies doesn't actually deal with the fundamental causes of poverty. And there are things that are linked with extreme poverty. We're actually talking about extreme poverty. You have food security and the challenges of nutrition, food security and nutrition. And let me tell you, last week I was watching one BBC program. Somebody, an environmentalist, was being interviewed. And he said that they were going for a disruptive revolution, because if your doctor tells you are going to die in 2 weeks, then it is science. You don't listen to all these other stories. If he says you are dying in 6 weeks, that when the projection is that about 6 billion people will die by 2030. So out of hunger and all the climate change and all the stuff. So that's why they're all heading out to the street. So that tells you something. How prepared are we, even though we have this poverty, these challenges of food security now and nutrition? What's the plan coming in the next 10 years? And that's the
critical question.
That's a very, very question. Then you've got also the poor literacy levels and education. Of course, you know there's a link between education and health.
In fact, I was going to get to that point.
The more aware you are, the rapid drop in your exposure to communicable diseases and all of that. And then, of course, agriculture is one, health is the other one, education is the other one. But that's not by any means all the underpinning causes. So we have to start addressing those. And in one of my interviews, I painted a picture of unemployment is a key one, of course.
Absolutely.
If the level of unemployment is what it is
then poverty
today,
is obviously going to
which
be
is over 20-something%. And one of the ministers of employment said it might get up to 30% by 2025. Now, unemployment is several times more than urbanization. Urbanization is 4.6%. So this is about a factor of 3 or 4. Then urbanization is higher than population growth, which is 3.2. And population growth is higher than our GDP growth rate, which is just about 2%. And that is also higher than our agricultural GDP growth. So it doesn't give you comfort, because you can see what they call this demographic time bomb.
No, absolutely.
But it stares you in the face.
Absolutely.
Because the young people, the people who are currently growing our food, are an average of 60 years old. And you couldn't see a propensity for young people to move into agriculture. So who's going to grow the food that we're going to eat in 2030? Who's going to grow them?
Yeah,
apart then from the compounding effect that the climate change says 30% less food will be produced anyway.
Yes.
So that's what they call demographic time bomb.
It's a worrying,
it's
a worrying thing. And let me bring Chineme Okafor there, because more and more African countries are moving away, or say they're moving away, from aid-based relationships with the developed economies, and are now more focused on improving trade, investment linkages, strengthening the capacity of their private sector. Are those the kinds of things that will help unemployment that Dr. Ife is talking about there, to reduce unemployment and improve the figures so that more people are able to go to school and life generally, the standard of living improves?
Well, yes and no. You cannot, I don't see Africa moving away from aid-based situation now, because we don't have our education system.
Well,
right.
Noting that Africa, of course, is not a country, as we emphasized.
Africa
because
I mean,
if you look at Botswana, for example, Botswana has moved into a middle-income country. Yeah. It doesn't actually qualify for aid anymore.
Yeah, but
and so its focus is more on these kinds of relationships. That's what it's gone to Japan to look for.
But of course, you have a lot more African countries that are not in that round.
And Nigeria, of course.
With Botswana. And so, for instance, our education system is so bad. And how are you going to fund the education when you have Nigeria, for instance, spend so much money on subsidy, subsidizing petrol, money that you should have put in the education system, you should have put in the health systems. You should have, kind of like put in rural electrification, because access to electricity is also very important. You know, when you go down to the rural populace, the rural people who cannot access electricity, you are also creating poverty. And so if countries in Africa who do not want the aids anymore think that it's the best way to go, they probably would have to have better plans on how to go to the world with, to get the kind of support they need. But I think that it should be, you can't move away from AIDS completely. You should take AIDS and also try and get some investments into your economy.
Right, because the data that's being set out by Save the Children points unambiguously to a world in 2030 in which over 300 million African children will be living in poverty. And by children, we mean like, young adults as well. I mean, and they'll account for over half of all extreme poverty in the world in 2030. Because whilst everyone else is improving with poverty and reducing poverty, including India, China, and all these places, even Latin America, it's growing in Africa. So clearly, on one level, things are going to get worse.
Absolutely, and I think that the fact that we are not able to educate ourselves, we are not able to educate our children, would push that faster than, as the report had said. Education is key. Education is the bedrock of development. If we cannot get our education system right, then I think we will continue to have this sort of report come to us. Right,
and Dr. Ken, just analyze. Okay, you wanted to make a point.
Yeah, what I wanted to say is that aid dependence is not an option for Nigeria.
Right.
Because aid here is less than 2% of our GDP. But there are countries where it's over 50%. Many African countries where it's 40 to 50%. But it's not an option here at all for Nigeria. And having said that, always bear in mind the impact of unemployment, whether you're a graduate or non-graduate. Every cadre is unemployed. The record is just our admonition. Now, I would think that we would have to follow what you have just mentioned, which is the link with trade. When Tony Blair did the African.
I remember you and I were in England.
Yes, we were all involved, yes. And then he said that the first thing he said is Africa should trade itself out of poverty. And because in the early 60s, we were accounting for 2% of world trade.
Yeah, he set up the Africa Commission or something.
We have 10% of world trade. But now we are less than 2% of world trade. And each percent is $80 billion in value. And then why trade? The issue about trade is that those economies that have shown tremendous growth and sustainable growth and have grown China, well over 400 million out of poverty, are the ones that have used trade as an issue. Indonesia, Malaysia, China, India, the whole trade was the main instrument that they used to fight their way out of poverty. And that is where you link developments in trade to your productive capacity, and then link it also back to your source of your raw material, rather than commodity trading. So that's the linkage.
Shouldn't you be advising the Nigerian government on what to do about there? Because I mean, you're working with the people who are considered to be those who come here to give them all kinds of wrong advice. I mean, the World Bank, the IMF, all of that. Perhaps you should be on the other side of the Mason-Dixon line.
Well, we're doing our best.
And I think, from what Professor said,
Sure.
I think that the trade should also include intellectual trade. The world is a huge intellectual.
You mean like intellectual property?
Intellectual property,
Yeah.
and all this sort of thing.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
There's trade in goods and there's trade in services.
Yeah, absolutely.
And the real thing between America and China today is that they're losing not just the 500 billion trade deficit, but 300 billion loss on intellectual property. Because China insists that if you are coming in, you have to partner with local.
Absolutely.
And then you go to bed with somebody you don't know, even if you know the thing is your intellectual property and your trade secrets, they're all on the line.
Yep.
And America said they've had enough, about 300 billion a year.
But services, of course, very important because outsourcing, for example,
that includes
which is
education.
Yeah, something
ICT,
that the Indians
culture,
have captured, right?
And Nollywood, they're all services.
Yeah. Okay. Stay with me in the studio, Dr. Ken Ife, who's a macroeconomic policy analyst as well as a lead consultant to ECOWAS, the World Bank and the African Development Bank, Chineme Okafo, who's a business and energy correspondent with This Day newspaper. Thank you for staying with us. And in your meetings with the World Bank and all these, the African Development Bank and so on, they always talk about, and you've worked with the United Nations as well, they talk about poverty reduction. I mean, how do they actually think they can tackle this problem? Because they make it a central goal. Every time you hear the World Bank or somebody talking, they're talking about poverty reduction.
Yeah, that's true. But what is common among all of them is the emphasis on private sector-led economy.
Right.
Because don't forget, we're all running market economy. And that market economy presumes that private sector would be the players,
the drivers of it.
The drivers of the market economy. So when you have an emasculation of the private sector, and then you have the public sector that doesn't really have business with business, what it does is it brings in monopolistic attitudes, all sorts of things it throws into the mix. So the issue is this: employment is best created by the private sector. Investment and wealth creation is best done by the private sector. Employment generation, which is a consequence of wealth creation, and then from employment you have revenue surplus, then you can use that to buy your way out of health and nutrition and sanitation. That is the cycle, and in the driving seat is private sector. And if you look at the economy, analyze the economy yourself, you find that 92 to 94% of the number of businesses are actually SMEs. And they employ over 90%.
Small and medium
enterprise. And they employ over 90% of the workforce. And they contribute over 48% of the GDP. And it confounds my understanding. Why would such a key player not be in the middle, the engine of the economy? And then you have thousands of businesses, so-called businesses that governments, states and federal got themselves into. And they're all dead and moribund. Get them over, turn them over to a private public sector partnership. Get them out so that they can roll those assets and create wealth. And so anywhere you go, the central message is free the private sector, set them free.
Yes, absolutely.
And then we know that there are binding constraints. There's no doubt about that. There are binding constraints that are limiting the effectiveness of the sector.
There have to be things that go with the private sector. You've got to free up capital. The banks have to be...
The capital is the worst part of it.
They have to be solvent enough to give out loans. I mean, they have to trust the economy enough to give out loans. But just looking at that report again, which I had a chance to sort of skim through, there are a number of things that stand out that Save the Children sort of report. First of all, the poorest people in Africa in general and Nigeria in particular, one of the things it emphasizes is that they're not benefiting sufficiently from the economic growth that's happening and the opportunities that are arising, which is partly the point that Dr. Ken is making there. And secondly, Africa has a very youthful population. I think you made that point as well. The median age is 18 in Africa compared to 40 in the UK. And governments are struggling to provide educational opportunities for them. And it is education, as we pointed out earlier, is it not, that could lift this region out of poverty?
Like I said earlier, education is very key. I said that it's a bedrock of development. Any economy that wants to develop really has to emphasize on education. But
you follow the government. I mean, you're a reporter, you're on the beat, you go out there, you talk to them. Do they not understand the importance of education?
Well, I think that, I don't know, but I read over the news that the new Minister of Education, who came back from the previous, the last term of President Buhari, when they told him about the level of education being poor and all of that, and he said that there's very little the government can do. And when that sort of conversation comes from that top hierarchy of government, you can imagine.
Yeah, but is he right?
It's absolutely wrong.
Is he right in the sense that, I mean, we're asking too much of government? I mean, I had Andrew Young here, the former UN ambassador, US ambassador to the UN. He was mayor of Atlanta, all of that. I mean, and he said that the big problem that he notices in Nigeria in particular is that everything is attributable to government. Somebody will wrap up a dirty piece of paper, a banana peel, throw it out the window and say, oh, the government doesn't clean the streets, and that sort of thing. Is that too much dependence on government? Because, I mean, you know, in many places, I mean, Harvard, Yale, all these universities, they're not owned by government. I mean, it's private people who provide that education.
Yeah, we're asking too much of government because government has decided to take too much for itself.
That's a good point.
You know, Prof said something. You need to, in a market-based economy, you need to free the private sector to do some of these things that the government should do. The major responsibility of government should be to stabilize the country, and when you stabilize the country, you stabilize the economy. Government shouldn't have any business doing business. The private sector creates the employment. And so when government decides to take all of this for itself, then we will ask the government too much.
You hold them to account.
Of course, because it's taken so much.
Right. And
so we will ask based on what you've taken.
Right.
So
your thoughts on that, Dr. Ife?
Well, they're just stating the obvious, because the sooner the government gets out of this, the better for the economy. But there are signs of change. There are signs of change. Because this Africa Free Trade Area agreement, you know, it caused a lot of concern, and then and the president listened. And what you see is, although within the ERGP plan, that's the Economic Recovery and Growth Plan, some value chains were targeted. But now what you now found was that the president has put more force by saying, okay, CBN, I want you to focus on 10 value chains and deliver end-to-end intervention. And that's not been done in this way before.
Yeah, but the problem...
That means you start from land clearing, land development, seed production, everywhere, all the way to the market. That has not been the approach before.
The problem, though...
But then, no, wait a minute. So apart from on the supply side, giving the go on the supply side, he also provided for the demand side by saying, okay, Presidential Order 003, you, all government departments, you must buy local. So you see...
Yeah, but why aren't they driving innocent cars?
Exactly. No, this is part of the thing. That is the thing now. They're not saying there's a demand Presidential Order 003, forcing them to buy. And then I was in Central Bank.
Let me make a note of that, 003.
Yes,
let's see what happens
Presidential Order
in the next year or so.
That says to them, look, you must buy local. And then I have been in a meeting at the Central Bank where the Central Bank reined in all the uniformed officers that is police, Air Force, Navy, NYSC, all of those, and said to them, this is what the president says we have to do. And then these are the garment manufacturers. You guys have to do an MOU. You got to buy from them. I'm not going to provide you any foreign exchange for importing anymore. And then that level of discussion is going on right now. And then you see that in some other areas where he's now lent his support to compliance. Now, when the president is supporting CBN on compliance, he says, if you smuggle in anything here, if you dump any goods here, I'll blacklist you. Now, that is the three things you need. Supply-based action, demand-based action, and compliance. And the three are happening at the same time.
Yeah, we have to see what that's going to do to, you know, the growing sort of patterns of inequality in Nigeria, which is part of the problem. But I want to thank you very much indeed, Dr. Ken Ife and Chineme Okafor. Thank you very much indeed. Well, that's it for this edition of the Arise interview. Join us again for a fresh edition tomorrow. From me and the entire team here in Abuja, bye-bye, and thank you for watching.